A black owner is kicked out of his own store by a racist manager, then returns to deliver justice. Mr. Samuel had built his dream from the ground up, a bustling store filled with life, laughter, and the warmth of a community that trusted him. But in a single devastating moment, a man he trusted turned against him, stealing everything. Keep watching to find out how he reclaimed his store. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Mr. Samuel had always been a dreamer, but he wasn't the kind of man who sat around waiting for things to happen. He was a man of action, a kind and hardworking black man who knew what he wanted in life. Ever since he was a young boy, he dreamed of opening his own store, a place where the whole community could come, feel welcome, and find everything they needed. It wasn't easy, though. Mr. Samuel worked long hours, saving every penny he could, and doing whatever it took to make his dream a reality. Years passed, and finally, after countless sacrifices, his hard work paid off. He opened Samuel's General Store in a small but busy town. The townspeople were friendly, and many became regular customers. They liked Mr. Samuel because he was always ready with a smile and knew everyone by name. His store was different. It wasn't just about selling goods. It was about creating a warm, safe place where everyone felt they belonged. At first, Mr. Samuel did everything by himself, stocking shelves, running the register, sweeping floors, but soon, as the store grew more popular, it became too much for one person to handle alone. So, Mr. Samuel decided to hire help. That's when he met Mr. White. Mr. White seemed like the perfect person for the job. He was sharp, efficient, and had experience managing stores. He knew how to handle customers and made the store run smoothly. Mr. Samuel was impressed. Things were going so well that Mr. White became the store's manager, handling the day-to-day operations while Mr. Samuel focused on other parts of the business. Mr. Samuel felt relieved, thinking he had found someone he could trust, someone who could help him build his dream even bigger. For a while, everything was perfect. Mr. White kept things in order, and business was booming. But one day, something strange happened. Mr. Samuel noticed a shift in the way Mr. White acted towards him. It was small things at first: cold stares, short responses, and even a few rude comments. Mr. Samuel thought maybe Mr. White was just having a bad week. After all, everyone has bad days, right? So, he didn't say anything, hoping things would get better. But they didn't. One chilly morning, Mr. Samuel decided to drop by his store earlier than usual. He liked to do that sometimes, to see how things were running when no one expected him to be around. As he approached the door, something felt off. There was no friendly buzz inside the store, no laughter, no chatter from customers. Instead, the atmosphere felt tense, almost uncomfortable. Mr. Samuel walked in and saw Mr. White standing by the counter, talking to a group of customers. But as soon as Mr. White saw him, his whole face changed. It was like a mask had dropped, and the friendly manager Mr. Samuel thought he knew was gone. "What are you doing here?" Mr. White asked, his voice sharp and cold. Mr. Samuel blinked in confusion. What kind of question was that? This was his store. He could come and go whenever he pleased. But before he could respond, Mr. White stepped forward, his expression darkening. "You don't belong here anymore," Mr. White said. For a moment, Mr. Samuel was too stunned to speak. The customers nearby stopped talking, their eyes wide as they watched the confrontation unfold. How could Mr. White say such a thing? Mr. Samuel had built this store from the ground up. It was his dream, his hard work, his everything. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Samuel finally managed to say, his voice shaking with confusion and anger. "This is my store." Mr. White smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Not anymore. Things have changed." Mr. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Mr. White was acting as if he owned the place, as if Mr. Samuel had no right to be there at all. The anger inside Mr. Samuel began to grow, bubbling up like a volcano ready to explode. How could Mr. White betray him like this? He had trusted him, given him responsibility, treated him like a partner, and now Mr. White was turning against him, trying to take what was his. "This is still my store," Mr. Samuel said firmly, standing tall. "You can't just kick me out." But Mr. White didn't back down. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared Mr. Samuel down, daring him to do something about it. The customers and employees all looked on in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. Some of them had known Mr. Samuel for years, but no one moved to help. With a smirk, Mr. White stepped closer. "I suggest you leave, Samuel. You don't want to cause a scene." The way he said Mr. Samuel's name sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was filled with something darker, something hateful. Mr. Samuel could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. For a moment, he considered fighting back right then and there. He wanted to yell, to scream, to demand that Mr. White leave instead. But as he looked around the store, he realized something important. This battle wasn't just about who was in the store right now. It was about the long run. He needed to think carefully. Without another word, Mr. Samuel turned and walked out of his store, his heart heavy with sorrow and rage. But deep down, a small fire of determination started to burn. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mr. White might think he had won today, but Mr. Samuel wasn't going to let anyone take away his dream. He would be back, and when he returned, he would be ready. Mr. Samuel stood outside his own store, his heart heavy with disbelief. The cold air nipped at his skin, but the shock he felt was far worse than the chill. How did this happen? Just moments ago, he had walked into his store, the place he built with his own hands, only to be thrown out by the man he had trusted most. Now, he found himself standing on the sidewalk, staring through the window like a stranger. He tried to wrap his mind around what Mr. White had said. "You don't belong here anymore." Those words echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. How could Mr. White say that? Mr. Samuel did belong there. He owned the store. This was his dream. And yet, it was slipping away right before his eyes. He turned to go back inside, determined to confront Mr. White again, but as he reached for the door, Mr. White appeared, blocking the entrance with a smug look on his face. "Go home, Samuel," Mr. White said coldly, his voice filled with a kind of arrogance that made Mr. Samuel's skin crawl. "There's nothing for you here anymore." "But this is my store," Mr. Samuel insisted, his voice breaking with desperation. "I built this place. You can't just." Mr. White cut him off, stepping closer. "It's not your store anymore. I run things now. You're done here." Mr. Samuel's hands trembled with a mixture of fear and rage, but before he could respond, a small crowd began to gather. Some were customers, others were employees who had worked with Mr. Samuel for years. They looked confused, worried even, but when they saw Mr. White standing tall and confident, their expressions changed. Mr. White smiled slyly at the crowd, then turned to address them. "Folks," he said smoothly, "there's been a little misunderstanding. Mr. Samuel doesn't work here anymore. I'm the owner now." The words hit Mr. Samuel like a punch in the gut. How could he stand there and lie like that? The employees exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of what to believe. Mr. Samuel wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, but his throat felt tight, like the words were stuck. "That's not true," Mr. Samuel finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. "This store is mine. I never sold it. He's lying to you." But Mr. White didn't miss a beat. He laughed softly, shaking his head as if Mr. Samuel was some sad, confused old man. "I'm afraid Samuel here is mistaken. He's been under a lot of stress. Sometimes people make bad decisions when they're not thinking clearly." The crowd murmured, and Mr. Samuel could see doubt beginning to cloud their eyes. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and Mr. White was watering it with every smooth lie. Mr. Samuel's heart sank as he realized how easy it was for Mr. White to twist the truth. He was making Mr. Samuel look like the one who had lost control. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Mr. Samuel turned away, walking down the street without another word. He could feel eyes watching him as he left, the whispers starting before he was even out of earshot. The rumors spread quickly through town. People whispered behind Mr. Samuel's back, wondering what had happened to him. Why wasn't he fighting to get his store back? Why had he let Mr. White take over so easily? Some thought maybe Mr. Samuel had gone broke and was too embarrassed to admit it. Others believed Mr. White's story, that Mr. Samuel was no longer fit to run a business. Mr. Samuel felt helpless, watching from a distance as Mr. White changed everything about the store. He fired longtime employees and replaced them with people who didn't care about the community. The friendly atmosphere that once filled the store was gone, replaced by something cold and unwelcoming. Customers began to complain, saying Mr. White was rude and unfair, but still, they came, because they didn't have many other options. Every time Mr. Samuel passed by the store, his heart broke a little more. He wanted to do something, to fight back, but he didn't know how. It was like watching his dream crumble before his eyes, and no matter how hard he tried to think of a way to stop it, the solution stayed just out of reach. One evening, as Mr. Samuel sat in his small kitchen, staring blankly at his dinner plate, he felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. The store had been everything to him. It wasn't just a place to make money. It was his way of giving back to the community, his way of making people feel welcome and important. And now, it was all gone. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He answered with little energy, not expecting much, but the voice on the other end caught his attention. Mr. Samuel. It was one of his old customers, a kind woman named Mrs. Jenkins. I just wanted to call and see how you were doing. We miss seeing you at the store. Mr. Samuel swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. I miss being there too, he said quietly. Mr. White isn't treating people right, Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her voice filled with concern. A lot of folks aren't happy with the way things are going. We're all wondering why you're letting this happen. Mr. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling a deep ache in his chest. I'm not letting it happen, he whispered. I just don't know how to fix it. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, Mrs. Jenkins spoke again, her voice firm but kind. Don't give up, Mr. Samuel. We believe in you. You've done so much for this town, and we haven't forgotten. You'll find a way. As he hung up the phone, Mr. Samuel felt a small spark of hope reignite within him. Mrs. Jenkins' words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Maybe he didn't know what to do right now, but he wasn't alone. The community still believed in him, and deep down, Mr. Samuel knew he couldn't let Mr. White win. One evening, sitting in his small, cozy kitchen, Mr. Samuel stared at the walls lined with old photos of his family. His father's voice echoed in his mind, telling him stories about standing up for what's right. His father had always been a pillar of strength, a man who believed in justice and fairness. Suddenly, Mr. Samuel remembered something, an old family friend, a lawyer who had helped his father long ago when they were in a tough spot. His heart racing with a mix of hope and nerves, Mr. Samuel picked up the phone and dialed the number. The phone rang a few times before a warm, familiar voice answered. Samuel, is that you? It was Mr. Roberts, the wise old lawyer who had been a trusted friend of the family for years. Mr. Samuel hadn't spoken to him in a long time, but hearing his voice brought back a sense of comfort and strength. Mr. Roberts, I need your help. Mr. Samuel said, his voice shaky but filled with determination. He told the lawyer everything, how he had been kicked out of his own store, how Mr. White had lied to everyone, and was now running the business like it was his own. Mr. Samuel explained the heartache and frustration he'd felt over the past few weeks, how he couldn't stand by any longer. Mr. Roberts listened carefully, not interrupting once, until Mr. Samuel finished. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Mr. Roberts spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I believe you, Samuel," he said, "but we're going to need proof. The law is on your side, but we need to be smart about this. It's not enough to tell people the truth. We have to show them the truth." Mr. Samuel felt a flicker of hope. But how? How can I prove that the store is mine? Mr. Roberts thought for a moment. You need to gather evidence. Real, solid evidence that Mr. White has been lying, that he's been mistreating customers, and that he's taken over your store illegally. We need documents, witnesses, anything that shows Mr. White is in the wrong. Mr. Samuel nodded, even though Mr. Roberts couldn't see him. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Mr. Roberts said. "We'll need to work quietly. If Mr. White finds out what we're doing, he could make things even harder for you. Gather the evidence, and then we'll hit him where it hurts, legally." The plan was clear, but carrying it out wouldn't be easy. Mr. Samuel knew he had to be careful, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a surge of strength. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Over the next few days, Mr. Samuel began reaching out to the people in town who still supported him. It was a delicate process. He couldn't just walk up to anyone and ask for help. Instead, he started with those he trusted most, longtime customers, neighbors, and friends who had been with him from the very beginning. Slowly, people began to come forward, each of them with a story about how Mr. White had mistreated them or tried to push them away from the store. Mrs. Jenkins told Mr. Samuel how Mr. White had raised prices on basic goods without explanation, leaving many of the poorer families in the community struggling to afford what they needed. Mr. Johnson, a loyal customer for over 10 years, explained how Mr. White had treated the staff with cruelty, cutting their hours and paying them less, all while demanding more work. As the stories piled up, Mr. Samuel started to see a pattern. Mr. White wasn't just trying to take over the store, he was trying to run it into the ground, caring only about his own power and control. The once warm, welcoming store was now a place of fear and frustration. But Mr. Samuel didn't stop there. He remembered Mr. Roberts' advice and began collecting documents, old contracts, ownership papers, anything that showed his name and his rightful place as the owner of the store. With each piece of evidence he gathered, Mr. Samuel felt a little stronger, a little more in control. But all the while, he knew he had to stay quiet. If Mr. White caught even the slightest hint of what he was doing, everything could fall apart. He kept his movements small and careful, meeting with people in secret, making sure no one saw him entering Mr. Roberts' office. Every day was a balancing act between gathering the information he needed and keeping his plan hidden from Mr. White's prying eyes. The tension built with each passing day. Mr. Samuel could feel it in the air, the weight of everything resting on his shoulders. He wondered if the town would believe him, if they would stand with him once the truth came out. After all, Mr. White had been so convincing in his lies, turning people against Mr. Samuel little by little. But deep down, Mr. Samuel knew he couldn't give up. He couldn't let fear stop him. And so, he pressed on, gathering more stories, more documents, more proof. The plan was coming together, but the real challenge was yet to come. Would the town believe him when the time came to reveal the truth? And more importantly, would Mr. White figure out what Mr. Samuel was planning before it was too late? Every night, as Mr. Samuel lay in bed, he wondered how long he could keep the secret. He knew that the time for justice was coming, but until then, he had to keep his head down, work quietly, and trust that the law would be on his side when the moment finally came. The day had finally come. Mr. Samuel had spent weeks quietly gathering evidence, talking to his supporters, and building his case. Now, with the documents in hand and the truth on his side, he felt ready to face the man who had tried to steal everything from him. The nerves were still there, fluttering in his chest, but something stronger was bubbling up inside him now: determination. Mr. Samuel walked toward his store. The familiar sight of it made his heart ache, but today wasn't about sadness. Today was about justice. As he approached, he could already see the small crowd gathered inside, customers going about their day, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Mr. Samuel pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. He stepped inside with a confidence he hadn't felt in weeks. The familiar smell of the store washed over him, but this time, it was different. He was no longer an outsider. This was his store, and he was here to reclaim it. At the counter, Mr. White was chatting with a customer, but the moment he saw Mr. Samuel, his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and the friendly facade he wore for everyone else fell away, replaced by a look of cold contempt. "What do you think you're doing here?" Mr. White's voice was sharp, and the room grew quieter as people began to notice the tension. Mr. Samuel didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the documents in his hand. His heart was pounding, but he stayed calm. He had waited for this moment, and now it was time. "I'm here to take back what's mine," Mr. Samuel said, his voice strong and steady. A murmur rippled through the store. The customers and employees exchanged confused looks, but all eyes were on Mr. Samuel and Mr. White. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. Mr. White laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Take back what? This store? You lost that a long time ago, Samuel. You have no business here." Mr. Samuel stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't lose anything. You stole it from me, and now I'm here to show everyone the truth." Mr. White's smug smile faltered for just a moment. "Truth? What truth? You don't have anything, Samuel. You're just making a fool of yourself." But Mr. Samuel was ready for this. He reached into his coat and pulled out the documents, papers that proved without a doubt that he was the rightful owner of the store. The room seemed to hold its breath as he laid them on the counter for everyone to see. "These are the original ownership papers," Mr. Samuel said, his voice clear and firm. "My name is on every one of them. This store belongs to me, and it always has." There was a gasp from one of the customers standing nearby. The employees leaned in, eyes wide, as they took in the documents. Mr. White's face paled. He glanced at the papers, and for the first time, he looked unsure. But he quickly recovered, putting on his usual sneer. "This proves nothing," Mr. White said, his voice shaking slightly. "You must have forged those papers. No one here is going to believe you." But the crowd was no longer on Mr. White's side. Whispers began to spread, and the employees who had been silently watching started to step forward. One of them, a young man named Jake, spoke up. "I've been working here for 3 years," Jake said, looking between Mr. Samuel and Mr. White. "Mr. Samuel built this place. We all know that. I don't know what you've been telling people, Mr. White, but I believe Mr. Samuel." Others began to nod, their faces filled with a mix of relief and anger. It was clear that Mr. White's grip on the store was slipping. Mr. White's eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out. He knew he was losing control. "You're all fools," he shouted, his voice rising with desperation. "This store is mine. Samuel doesn't belong here anymore." But Mr. Samuel wasn't backing down. He stepped closer to Mr. White, his calm presence in stark contrast to Mr. White's growing panic. "I have every legal right to this store," Mr. Samuel said, locking eyes with Mr. White. "And you know it. The law is on my side, and everyone here knows the truth now." The crowd was fully behind Mr. Samuel now, their eyes fixed on him with respect and admiration. They could see the courage it had taken for him to come back and fight for what was rightfully his. The employees stood taller, emboldened by Mr. Samuel's strength. Mr. White's face twisted in anger. "You think this is over? I won't go down without a fight." For a moment, it seemed like Mr. White might actually lash out, but before he could do anything, the door to the store opened again. In walked Mr. Roberts, the lawyer, followed by a police officer. The room went silent. Mr. Roberts walked straight up to Mr. Samuel and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Everything's in order, Samuel," he said calmly. "We have all the proof we need. The police are here to make sure this ends peacefully." Mr. White's face was drained of color, his confidence shattered. He looked around the store, seeing the angry faces of the customers and employees who had once trusted him. His lies had crumbled, and there was nowhere left to hide. With a final look of defeat, Mr. White turned and walked out of the store, the police officer following closely behind. The moment the door closed behind them, the room erupted into cheers. Mr. Samuel stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He had done it. He had stood up for himself, for his store, and for everything he believed in. As the crowd gathered around him, thanking him and congratulating him, Mr. Samuel knew that justice had been served. This was his store again, and he would never let anyone take it from him. Mr. White's footsteps echoed through the store as he rushed for the door, panic spreading across his face. He knew his lies had unraveled, and now, the truth was closing in. He pushed past customers, ignoring their stares, as he desperately reached for the door handle. But just as he flung the door open, 2 police officers and Mr. Roberts, the lawyer, stepped inside, blocking his escape. "Going somewhere, Mr. White?" Mr. Roberts asked calmly, his voice steady and firm. The crowd fell silent, their eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Mr. White froze, his face pale as the officers approached. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and Mr. White's hands began to tremble. "You can't do this," Mr. White shouted, his voice high with fear. "This is my store. I've done nothing wrong." But Mr. Samuel stepped forward, the stack of documents still in his hand. "No, Mr. White," he said, his voice strong. "You've done plenty wrong. You tried to steal my store, but it's over now. The truth has come out." The officer took the documents from Mr. Samuel and glanced through them, nodding before turning to Mr. White. "You're under arrest for fraud," the officer said, taking Mr. White's wrists and snapping the handcuffs around them. The room was tense with silence as Mr. White struggled for a moment, his face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this, Samuel," he yelled, but the words carried no weight anymore. The lies were gone, and the town could see him for what he truly was. The officer led Mr. White out of the store, his head hung low in defeat. As the door closed behind them, the store was quiet, the air thick with disbelief. For a moment, everyone stood still, processing what had just happened. Then, one by one, the customers and employees began to cheer. The sound grew louder, filling the room with the kind of joy and relief Mr. Samuel hadn't felt in weeks. "Thank you, Mr. Samuel," someone called from the back of the store. "We knew you'd come through." People rushed to shake his hand, to congratulate him, to show their support. Mr. Samuel smiled, feeling overwhelmed by the love and appreciation pouring out from the community. He had spent so many sleepless nights worrying about whether they would believe him, wondering if he could ever regain their trust. But standing here, surrounded by his loyal customers and friends, he knew that the town hadn't abandoned him. They had just needed the truth. "Thank you," Mr. Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for standing by me, for believing in me when things looked darkest. This store has always been about the community, about making sure everyone feels welcome, and with your help, we've brought it back to what it was meant to be." The crowd cheered again, and Mr. Samuel's heart swelled with pride. The store was his again, truly his. But more than that, he had gained something far more valuable. He had learned to trust himself, to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. He had faced betrayal, loss, and doubt, but he had come out stronger on the other side. In the days that followed, Mr. Samuel worked hard to bring the store back to its former glory. The employees who had left because of Mr. White's harsh management returned, eager to work under Mr. Samuel's kind and fair leadership once more. Together, they restocked the shelves, cleaned the aisles, and welcomed back the customers who had grown distant during Mr. White's reign. It wasn't long before the store was buzzing with life again. People returned not just to shop, but to catch up with Mr. Samuel, to chat with the friendly staff, and to enjoy the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had always made Samuel's general store special. But something was different now. The store didn't just feel like a place to buy goods. It felt like a symbol of strength and resilience, a testament to Mr. Samuel's determination and the community's belief in him. It wasn't just a store anymore. It was a beacon of hope, proof that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. One afternoon, as Mr. Samuel stood behind the counter, ringing up a customer, an older man approached him. It was Mr. Johnson, one of his oldest and most loyal customers. "You did good, Samuel," Mr. Johnson said with a nod, his voice filled with pride. "We all knew you were the rightful owner, but seeing you fight for it, it reminded us what you stand for. This store is more than a business. It's part of this town, just like you." Mr. Samuel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. That means more than you know." As Mr. Johnson left the store, Mr. Samuel looked around at the bustling aisles, the happy faces, and the sense of peace that had returned. He had fought for his dream, and now it was better than ever. He had learned so much through the struggle, not just about the people around him, but about himself. He had learned to never give up, to never let anyone take advantage of him again. And he knew, deep down, that the store would always be safe in his hands. The community had rallied behind him, and together, they had reclaimed what was rightfully his. The town had come to realize they were wrong to doubt him, and they celebrated his strength and determination. But this is just one story of triumph. Want more tales of courage, justice, and the power of never giving up? Subscribe now and be the first to hear stories that inspire and captivate.